The Grand Piano Project has begun to resemble the film Up, which followed a group of kids across their lifetimes in 9 episodes spaced 7 years apart. Well, not precisely, but we were quite young, mostly in our mid-20s in the 70s when we all lived in the Bay Area, and more or less middle-aged when we produced the Grand Piano books. And now we're old. Ouch, I know. My contribution to the books are relatively brief. I've decided to read the pieces in my volume 2, and in the volume 2 and 4, as well as a poem I included and actually wrote for volume 10. I'm also going to read and talk about some parts of Bob Perelman's essay in volume 2 and mix in some new writing as I go along. I'll start with my number 2. That is sort of a love story to San Francisco, the romance I had with San Francisco when I first moved there in 1972 with Chuck. For me, the 1970s was the decade when I lived in San Francisco. Those of you who grew up in the Bay Area probably can't imagine what that meant. When I was, say, 19 in San Diego, and someone said they were going to the city, they didn't mean downtown. They meant that they were going to hitchhike north. San Francisco was mythic then. I wouldn't have admitted it, but even when I was living there, I would get goosebumps when I drove west across the Bay Bridge. San Francisco meant that I had run away from home. It was the antithesis of everything I hated about home, or so I thought. I had studied at Berkeley in 1969 and 70, then went home, that is back to San Diego, and moved to San Francisco with Chuck in 1972 to get an MA at San Francisco State. I was 25. I remember looking at the people on the streets with a kind of awe when I first arrived. I felt like a bumpkin. One of my first thoughts was, I've got to get new clothes. Some people might say I overdid it. Kathleen Fraser was reminiscing at the Page Mothers event about first seeing me in her class at San Francisco State in the fall of 72. Apparently, I was wearing huge platform shoes and purple nail polish. I was just adapting to what I took to be the costume of my native Bohemian tribe. Actually, a lot of my ideas of the local customs came to me from gay men. The 70s was the period in which gender norms were beginning to crumble. Androgyny and ambiguity were being celebrated in San Francisco, and gender was being performed. This was the period of the Angels of Light shows with their gender fuck aesthetics. Chuck and I would go dancing at a club called Lion in Pacific Heights, where there were gays and straights, men and women. People would ask, "What are you?" with friendly interest. This was the period that nurtured Kathy Acker as the Black Tarantula. She actually lived not too far from me, away from me for a while in San Francisco. It didn't last very long. By the later 70s, feminism was in a separatist phase, and the macho clone style had overtaken the gay community. Once again, one was asked to be clearly readable, something that has always bored me. But of course, the positive change brought about by gay liberation and second wave feminism is still being felt. I think women poets who came into the art before the 70s faced a much more difficult battle. Perhaps the ambiguity, uncertainty, and yes, even malaise of the period, it was the time of Watergate after all, left space for our entrance. So be it. Coming to adulthood then and there allowed me a freedom and confidence that wouldn't have been otherwise available. When we left the Bay Area, it was because of the economy. I couldn't find a decent job, and Chuck had a job that didn't pay the bills. When I got pregnant, it was clear we couldn't keep clinging to this stagflating edge any longer, but leaving San Francisco was one of the hardest things I ever did. I'm not seeing my own image on the screen anymore. Is that a problem? Oh well. Okay, just going forward.
You look great.
Okay.
Carla.
Oh, thank you, Carla. So one of my favorite entries in the books is Bob Perelman's piece in that same volume, volume 2. I like the way it tries to locate the slippery present moment. He starts with the beginning of The Day Lady Died by Frank O'Hara, and then morphs it to make it his own, using it to find the moment he occupied in 2005, or to try to. So, quote, "It's 2012 in New York." I know I did that wrong. Oops. "It's 12:20 in New York, 3 days after Bastille Day." No, not exactly. It's 3 decades after 1975, and the Bastille has been re-erected with a vengeance. It has a new name, Guantanamo, but inside it's the same old, with drastically updated techniques. Of course, now 2005 itself seems antique. The men kept at Guantanamo are old. It is still an outrage, but so many outrages have been layered over it in the subsequent years. For me personally, 2005 is the year I was diagnosed with the cancer that was supposed to kill me. The odds were grim, but here I am, or am I? I feel like there are a very large number of parallel universes just inches away in which I'm dead. My essay in volume 4 is partly at least about that experience. And it's called Everyday Life. I write now in and from an odd moment, one which has bracketed everyday life, setting it at a distance. I have been diagnosed with adrenocortical cancer, a very rare and often fatal disease. Such a thing, to quote the song Sway from the Rolling Stones' 1971 album Sticky Fingers, quote, "destroys your notion of circular time." The chorus adds, "It's just that demon, life, got me in its sway." Of course, he may have said demon life, which would be less interesting, but I'll keep my version. Circular time and everyday life seem exotic to me now, and yet they inspire nostalgia. I am still doing and seeing and hearing things that I haven't seen, heard, done since before my diagnosis. These sights, sounds, events are estranged. They acknowledge one another at a distance. Anyone could write this. I'm not telling you anything you can't guess, but that's what writers do. We point to the obvious. See? My poems respond to everyday life by using happenstance. Whatever happens by within a certain time frame can enter them. So they are penetrable, interrupted, and yet I hope they hang together somehow, sometimes. I start again and again from some unexpected sight or speech. Take this, a few stanzas from my poem Coexistence. "Hey, watch me say, 'Hi, fishy,' someone shouts, but I'm crossing my K's." I wrote this in Rubio's restaurant, a fish taco chain that always features an aquarium. A child yelled the quoted line, "Hey, watch me say hi, fishy," maybe to his mother, maybe to anyone who would listen. I identified with that kid. I mean, I felt like that's what poets do. "Hey, watch me say hi, fishy," even as he distracted me and messed up my handwriting so that I crossed my K's. My recent cancer diagnosis is, of course, the ultimate unexpected input. It's as if some god had said, "Let's see you work around this." And many of the poems I've written since my surgery on June 15th, 2006, have had something to do with cancer, or at least death. But the question becomes, can other things, new things, still break in? I hope so. Life can still be boring, but right below the boredom is suspense. I had a successful surgery, but this is understood to be a sort of hiatus in which we wait to see whether the disease will reappear. Will I live as if I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop or the parenthesis to close? Everyday life seems largely composed of the placid expanse of theoretical time surrounding it. That's what's missing now. Of course, it had been shrinking anyway as I aged. In the 70s, any action made was seemingly, I'm going to take that again. In the 70s, any action made seemingly infinite ripples in this ocean of theoretical time. At least it felt that way. And single words, fragmented phrases had boundless potential too. We must believe something like that, I guess, if we've kept writing this poetry. So thinking back about my brush with death, I remember the hospital vividly, though when I went back to thank the nurses just a few weeks later, I didn't recognize any of them. That's strange, to say the least. I just put flowers at the nurse's station and left. So what is memory? I suspect most people, and this is true of me, remember what hurts them mostly and what gives them joy. Once we have an idea of who we are, we may hold on to memories that confirm this idea and suppress those that don't. So the past is full of holes. No wonder our stories don't match. I wonder if everyone listening now knows that the Grand Piano was once a coffee bar cafe with a piano in it on Haight Street, where we, our little gang, ran a reading series for, I don't know, quite a while. I was actually a coordinator of that series for maybe a year. I have a poor grasp of time, along with Ted Pearson. Tom Mandel, the previous coordinator, talked me into doing it. I sometimes remember myself as an outsider, but there I was for a long moment, the center of all, well, enough riffs on O'Hara. That's an inside joke, maybe. Thinking about the past, or for that matter, the future, gives me vertigo. Why? Maybe if I look too far into them, I'm not there. Is that it? And then there's the present. It takes some time for light to reach our eyes, and it takes our brains a while to consciously register the inputs it receives. That means that, in fact, none of us has ever seen the present. The present is the recent past, among other things. I like Bob's take on the present in his Grand Piano essay. On page 81 of volume 2, he says, quote, I found myself in the literary present in San Francisco. Why? Because, quote, the only present we ever have is intensely shared attention. I think that's a great definition, actually, even if it does briefly conjure the image of heads bent over a Ouija board for me. In his Grand Piano video recently, Steve Benson talked about sustained mutual play as a feature of language writing then. This is what I see when I watch my 5-year-old granddaughters improvise together. They are coordinating their fantasies. This is what it means to be human. And play makes change possible, maybe. We all know play isn't always nice. As Bob writes, quote, one of the characteristics that was so lively and occasionally daunting about our scene for me was the instantaneity of judgment and the violence of that. Suddenly, certain poems and poets were pronounced to be awful. There were also enthusiasms of equal intensity. It was compelling to watch these ferocious judgments being hurled. Ah, this is what it was like to live in the present. One could, in collaboration, be a writer in the actual world, unquote. I noticed Bob portrays himself as watching. I was most often a watcher too. I guess by that I mean I wasn't in the room where the manifestos were drafted. But was there such a room? Who decided, for instance, even for a minute, that poetry should be non-referential? I'm looking at you, Ron. I was watching and learning. Bob goes on to say, we want to change the map to include ourselves, but we also continue to live in the place where the various hand grenades fell. Do I miss those days? Kind of, but I'm sure those days are the present for others somewhere today. And besides, that excitement comes back to me when I'm in the midst of a poem. Something I do like about my contributions to the grand piano books is the way they sometimes morphed into poems. That happened in my piece for the Grand Piano 10. I was thinking about the project and about memory work in general when I wrote Autobiography, Earned Burial, which appears in that volume. I'll read that and then I'll finish with a new poem called Finally that has something to do with time passing and with couples aging together. So this is from Grand Piano 10. Autobiography, Earned Burial. I could say authenticity will have been about trying to overtake the past, inhabit it long enough to look around, say, oh, but the past is tricky, holds off. So are we really moving? Or is this something like the way form appears to chase function? I might hazard that my life's course has been somewhat unusual. When I say that, I hear both an eager claim and a sentence that attempts to distance itself by adopting the style of a 19th century English gentleman. The failed authority of such sentences is soothing, like watching masterpiece theater. When I recount my experiences, whatever they may have been, I'm aware of piping tunes I've heard before, or jumbled snatches of familiar tunes. The fancy cannot cheat for very long, can it? In the moment of experience, one may drown while another looks on. Okay, and finally, not afterglow, not the last word. Still, they were able to more or less enjoy the feeling of being washed up together on what was not really a floodplain, from which the not quite water had receded, leaving a large number of more or less interesting artifacts, which they had learned appeared to them differently. So that what she saw as a large wooden radio, he saw as a fireplace mantle. And what she saw as self-sufficiency, he saw as strangulation. In past times, they had fought bitterly about what things were, what they should or should not be. Now they tried to guess what the other would call any object they spotted. They had come to find failure hilarious and even faked it on some occasions. Okay, that's all for me.
Thank you, Rae. Let me invite everyone to go to gallery mode. We can see each other. And push the little reaction to raise your hand if you have a question or comment to offer, or put it in chat, and I'll look at chat.
Okay.
Let me know if you see a hand.
No one has questions, huh?
Huh?
It's
No,
hard to
I'm,
ask questions.
no, it's, without asking a question, I'm just gonna say that I love that, Rae. I loved it. I found it really moving, actually. And I'm just so glad, it's an idiotic thing to say. I'm sorry. I'm just so glad that I have you in a little square in front of me and can hear you do that and see you do it.
Oh,
It's really wonderful.
that's sweet. Thank you.
I don't remember us being quite so young as some of you remember. I don't even remember you being quite so young, Rae. As I was about to write you, really, in an email today, you're When we met, I think we met in early '77 for coffee at the cafe at the corner of Noe and Market, the name of which I
Right.
can't
Well, I
remember.
moved to San Francisco. I was starting from when I moved to San Francisco.
Oh, sure.
in 1972, and I was 25. So that's what I was talking about in the beginning. And then so I was a little older by 77, moving into my late 20s by then. But
A few weeks from 30, actually. Of course, I was really old, but let's let that go.
yeah, we weren't all the same age. But I feel like, I was talking about having very romantic ideas about San Francisco that were kind of immature, that were partly based on, I don't know, songs about San Francisco and the idea that, San Francisco was the land of the counterculture and poetry and freedom, and which wasn't entirely false, but
No, it was true.
yeah, but I was high on it the way young people are. So that's all.
Barry.
So Han, there was one moment that really struck me, which was how generative it was to go dancing in the spaces you were talking about, and the gender fluidity, even though everybody wanted to know precisely how you identified, which is also interesting information. And then moving quickly from that to high fishy, this way in which you're picking up on, stuff that's very liminal and at the edge of perception or at the edge of cognition in a certain way. And so retrospectively, I wonder how you'd connect those two things. One, the sort of the gender openness at that time, but also the openness to hearing things and, hearing them in odd, uncharacteristic ways.
Well, for me, that's probably just the way my brain's wired. But I did say something like that in the not about my brain, but about the way that the fluidity and tolerance for ambiguity in the scene in that place at that time, I think was generative, not just, beyond whatever poetics conversations we had, there was this larger environment in which all kinds of experimentation and identity flux was being encouraged. And, that felt great to me. I've always liked to be, this is immature too, I suppose, but I've always liked to be kind of free from definition and squishy when it comes to where I am and what I am. They won't let you anymore, now you have to fill out a long drop down menu if you want to go to a conference or anything about exactly what you are, but we won't go there.
You have to specify your pronouns.
Which beyond that, but
One other remark about the difference is, I think I went and danced in those places too, of course, we all did. And I don't think there was so much an interest in how you identified as there was an interest in whether you wanted to have sex. And whether you had, or, do you have sex with the kind of person I am?
Mm-hmm.
And if not, would you like to start right now? And that, I think, is really quite a big difference there's quite a big difference between that and the way in which gender fluidity now can be so easily translated into pronouns. Pronouns are not the most lively words. But in any case, there you are. That's all. Just a comment.
Yeah, I don't want to turn this into criticizing the young and the way they like to now, I would say, hyper-define their gender and sexuality. I'm sure that is freeing to them in a way that I don't quite understand, but I don't mean to make a judgment because I'm kind of past it. I'm not part of it. But I was just saying that the kind of general ambient flux and fluidity and freedom that was San Francisco in that moment was very enabling, I think, maybe also to women, to women writers. I mean, I didn't particularly feel that I had to, you know, be a girl, I guess, or a boy or anything.
Well, Ray,
Yeah.
Ron here.
I know you, yes.
Yes. You know, I think it was in some ways more complicated than that. I recall, I mean, you and I both lived on Sacramento Street, as did Ronald Johnson. And I recall the first time I went over to his collective household, which called itself the Vinyl Vatican, being shocked at in the middle of the hallway, this diamond-shaped painting that if you could stand back far enough away from it, which was hard to do in a railroad flat hallway, you would see was a giant swastika. You know, he was most concerned, first time I went and visited him, that I not tell Jonathan Williams that he was working as a cook at a cowboy bar down on Folsom Street. That you know, the idea being that he should be at Chez Panisse or something, I suppose, at least according to Jonathan. So there was, you know, a lot of testing, but there were all kinds of boundaries people were putting out in different kinds of ways that seemed fairly complicated to negotiate at the time.
Yeah, no doubt. I don't want to be, I don't know how I got to be the expert of boundaries, but.
Hey, Ron, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Hi, Bob.
Hi. Hey, tell me
you.
about this swastika. Was it ironic? Was it?
It was a diamond-shaped painting with a couple of sort of colors as background. One was purple, I think the other was light green. And around the edge, mostly the edge, but it crossed over in the center, was this, you know, these black stripes that if you could stand back far enough, would in fact have been a swastika. We're a swastika.
Was it a, you know?
Now, it was a collective household, and I didn't know if he was the one responsible for that or not. And I never found out.
Ron Johnson painting in 70.
Yeah, well, yes, in 72, but 72, no, 73, because that's when that was the year that I lived on Sacramento Street, and then Barry convinced me to move over to Missouri. So, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about that time for me is how specific each year was.
Ray, oh, there she is.
Yeah, there's Ray. Yeah.
Hi, Francie.
Hi. I am just peeking in. I have to go
Yes.
back to cooking dinner.
Okay. Krishna wants me to tell Ray that she really loved listening to the reading. And I want to tell Ray that I think that's the title of her next book she's wearing on her chest.
Ontology, oh yeah. Well, it has its own, that word has its own history to be with,
Okay.
but still, yeah.
No, but with the H.
It might be, that's a good idea.
Questions?
Well, Ray, I thought it was.
Carla's got her hand up there.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to comment.
Yes.
I think this is a very, I don't know if it's interesting in what seems fertile to me about it, but it's a thing that I thought, which is that there is a gendering that is happening in this, because the kind of hyper masculinity and the conceptualization of perfection in the blurry space that Ron is pointing to is extremely different than what Rae or I would have experienced as women, possibly, who felt that they didn't have to avow some kind of sense of what the value of their gendering was at any given moment. But there's a lot of like codes and code switching and Ravidic and sort of maybe rigidity happening all simultaneously that taps into the kind of, you know, historical periods that precede and catapult us into that moment that we're in. So I found that like, it's just an interesting conversation, and thinking about like the code as part of it, and not entirely in a felicitous manner either, but one that's sort of compelling. So it's a comment rather than a question, but I'm happy to turn it into one.
Yeah. What were you going to say, Bob?
Oh, I don't know, the Zoom format is so awkward. It's very hard to hear everybody and keep track of I don't mean to wax nostalgic, which seems like the worst thing, but it was easier at the talks when we were all in the same room.
No kidding.
Speaking of gender, let me
Oh
just say
gosh,
that
I know.
it was easier for some of you than others.
I know. I'm
Agreed.
Mhm.
yeah.
And
So there were spaces in which you could at least pretend or play is a better word, play with getting beyond gender. And then there were spaces where, you know, traditional gender roles still seem to mean something, I guess.
I'll say.
May I jump in
Yeah.
here? Yeah, thinking about the gendering and the blurring of boundaries, I was the one of all of us that came with visible children attached, from whom I neither wanted to nor could have detached myself, since they were literally present at the grand piano. One of them has remembered doing drawings and homework under the grand piano and not understanding a damn word that anyone was saying, but knowing that it was very important. But I don't think I ever, certainly never consciously, was able to move out of the gendering that comes with being a mother, which is just a comment to offer into it, that it was in my mind that freedom existed, but in actual practical effect, I was very much responsible for having these two kids along, and making sure they were okay, and that then I was free to do whatever I wanted with whomever I was talking to at the time. Anyway, just another comment to sort of add complexity to the situation.
Well, you were in a slightly different life stage, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Tom also had kids at that period, but they weren't living with him.
Right.
So
They were, yeah.
Anyway, just an interesting.
But this seems to be a conversation just amongst ourselves. I wonder if anyone who's
Jean has her hand
I'd like
up there,
to-
so
Jean.
Jean.
I'd like to call on Jean.
Yeah, good.
Okay, hello. I was very interested. I think the name of the poem you concluded your talk with was While. Is that correct?
No, it's finally.
Finally, but the concept while comes up and it does it not? That's right. I'm trying to get back to the concept of while, which is in another one of your recent poems. So I guess what I would ask is, since you were trying to document different times, and because I know the concept of while seems important, in what ways is that important now and not even part of your thinking in the 70s?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure whether you're saying while with the WHILE or wild as in W.
No, WH.
Okay, that's good. I was afraid.
I mean, because it
Wild.
relates to time, you know, while is while present or is it past? Is it, it's not, is it point to the future?
While seems to me to mean something concurrent, you know, like sort of like what I quoted Bob saying, that the present is a kind of shared attention. So you do this while I do that. So it's a sort of, while implies a kind of coming together and creating simultaneity that, you know, maybe brief, but is active, or, you know, somebody has to be thinking that way. You know, it implies two people or two things in coordination, to me at least, while, which is, so that makes it kind of a dynamic concept.
I guess it also suggests a continuity that's not really present in present, past, or future. That's something continuous.
But also the fact that a thing which in another context might appear to be only itself, let's say a poem on a page, actually occurs in a world where other things are happening at that moment, just as being at the grand piano. There might be a reading, but there also might be one of Lynn's kids under the piano doing their homework, or there might be Ron and I not able to keep our mouths shut and, you know, and heckling somebody. And so it's not a matter only of simultaneity, but a matter of action, or the thing occurring in a world full of interference and patterning that is random, not necessarily oppositional, but randomly unrelated, but significant.
And you know, while can also, they can be contestatory. I'm thinking of something Kit told me. It's a story Ted Berrigan told about being at the grand piano, giving a reading, and somebody was sitting at the piano while Ted was reading and started playing the piano. And Ted instantly stopped and said, you can't, that's just not going to work. I can't read while you're playing. So the while was like, it can't happen. I can't read while you're playing. You can't play while I'm reading.
Yeah,
totally.
Can you hear me, Ray?
I remember that reading quite well. We had Ted and George Stanley on the same bill, and each of them brought about 55 people to the reading, virtually none of whom read the other poet. And I remember after that event going to try, or attempting to go to both parties, first at George Stanley's and then over to where Ted was, which may or may not have been Bob's place on Folsom Street. But in any case, both places were sort of lots of people telling the poet reader how fabulous they were and how uninteresting the other poet was. And one thing I noticed was that Ted stopped the people telling him that and started explaining to them why he thought George Stanley was a great poet. And they sort of were all sort of sitting there with their mouths wide open because he had really been paying attention.
Man.
You know, that story, Bob, is also written into the grand piano. In fact, that may be where you got it. And as I remember, what happened was, what Ted actually said was, step away from the piano, sport. And then he said, I can compete with a lot of things, but I can't compete with music.
Right, right. I remember that.
Also,
Just on-
also, I would point out that my stepdaughter Erica was also asleep under the piano.
Right. Hey, Ron, one thing recalling that particular reading and any number of others, actually, I'll remind you that that's a reading you and I put on, and that when we sat down to think about the readings, we often made a point of trying to put together people whose work might seem oppositional in that way, and especially because they would each bring in a new audience for the other poet.
Yeah.
Right. And that sometimes was successful and sometimes was wildly unsuccessful.
I'll say yes. Yes.
No, the reading that was the night Elvis died, which was supposed to have been Richard Astle, who was at that point an experimental fiction writer, and Barry Alpert was probably the epitome of the failed reading in those terms. Richard got cold feet and so drove out to, instead of driving up to San Francisco, as he said he was going to, he went and drove out to the desert so that nobody could call him and say, why aren't you here? And Barry had absconded with a lot of those very small bottles of alcohol you get on airplanes, and they were mostly sweet drinks of various kinds, but he'd had a dozen or so, and so he was not in great shape doing his reading either without the other person. And it had a tiny audience because neither of them brought anybody. So
Yes,
Well, I'm going
fortunately.
to barge in here because there's a discussion about David Tilley not being able to.
John
it's-
Granger.
John Granger.
John Granger wants to ask.
John Granger. Okay, so
Hey, hey.
John
Hi.
wants to say something. And
But
put
But
John
who can hear?
Granger
Can
on
anybody
now?
hear me?
Yes,
Ah,
yes, I can hear
Okay,
you.
good. Ray,
Yeah, so
I-
sorry, but I just wanted to make sure that the voice got through. Sorry,
Thanks, Carla.
John.
That's beautiful. Thanks, Ray. I really liked what you said about judgment and violence. I thought that was a wonderful thing. So it seems foundational to really all of philosophy. It's so important to understand the relation of thinking and judgment to violence. I thought that was great. So I'm just saying, I'm glad that came up. That's all.
I wish I could take credit for that. I was actually quoting Bob Perelman and his
Oh, so,
essay
well then,
in
hey,
Grand
Bob.
Piano 2, which I liked a lot.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. There is something thrilling, but also potentially violent about making a judgment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not just that happened then in that context.
No, I know,
It's just a
anytime.
very interesting,
Yeah.
interesting idea there. Anyway, thanks.
Okay, this has been a great wide-ranging discussion, and we're about out of time. So I want to thank Rae for her reading. I want to thank Barry for hosting us. I want to thank each of you for coming out tonight. Have a good
Well,
night.
thanks, Ray. It was great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Really great.
It's nice to see you all.